State Affairs with Edmondo Bilo is live. State Affairs with Edmondo Bilo is live. Stay tuned. Hello. Let's do it again. Welcome to another class of history, politics, and power. On this edition of the show, we will look at Afrophobia. Afrophobia. South Africa expels Africans. That is the subject. Some call it xenophobia. But xenophobia is broader. Afrophobia is narrower, and it captures the essence of this edition of State Affairs. So today, we begin with the number 1490. 1490. That is the total number of Nigerians who have now been lifted out of South Africa. 1490 Nigerians have now been airlifted out of South Africa in a 5-phase evacuation. Nigerians are leaving. Not Nigerians alone. Just across the West African coast, Ghana has been running its own evacuation program. More than 900 Ghanaians have already returned home. And from East Africa, Kenya has evacuated more than 400 Kenyans out of South Africa. So we are talking about close to 3,000 persons across 3 nations have been airlifted from South Africa to their homelands. So what we are seeing is not about Africans running from war, not because of famine, but because fellow Africans told them they did not belong. Official statements from countries speak of citizens' diplomacy. They talk of consular protection. But we have Africans fleeing from Africans. People who crossed borders in search of opportunity only find themselves targets of mobs in Africa. The Nigerian government says it's unacceptable. Ghana's High Commissioner has petitioned the African Union. Kenya's Foreign Minister has held urgent calls with South African counterparts. South African authorities call it isolated incidents. But for the families of the Nigerians, the Kenyans, the Ghanaians, the Mozambicans, for the families that have experienced the pain, one thing is sure, that the Afrophobia we talk about today is not new, and it's not unique to South Africa. Just that South Africa has become the epicenter. The issue has sparked diplomatic tensions that have seen Ghana postpone a visit by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. So on this episode, we will start from Johannesburg. Johannesburg, the place of pain. We will start from South Africa, the place where Africans burn the shops of Africans, the place experiencing the politics of economic resentment. We will go back to Ghana in 1969. Remember the Aliens Compliance Order? How Ghana expelled thousands of West Africans, mostly Nigerians, under the guise of protecting local jobs. Then, we moved to Nigeria in the 1980s, when Nigeria evacuated Ghanaians, Malians, Togolese out of Nigeria. So I'm talking of that Nigeria that now evacuates its citizens from South Africa. In the 1980s, Nigeria turned around and expelled over 1 million African migrants in a single brutal swoop. It was brutal. Nigeria chased African migrants out of Nigeria under the government of Shehu Shagari. And it is the largest mass deportation in African history. What Nigeria did in the 1980s is the largest mass deportation in African history. But why do we keep repeating this circle? Why do we preach Pan-Africanism in theory, yet practice nativism in our markets? Why do we do that? Is it a place of the African? Africans are concerned. From the apartheid era, when there was the passed laws that taught South Africans to police skin color, from that time to Ghana's post-independence anxiety about foreign domination, to Nigeria's austerity-driven scapegoating in the 1980s, we would trace the deep roots of Afrophobia. Are these spontaneous outbursts of frustration or deliberate political tools wielded by elites to distract from failing governance? If we cannot treat each other with dignity on the same continent, what hope do we have of demanding dignity from the rest of the world? It is not a comfortable history, but it is our history. Sorry about that noise. From Soweto to Accra to Lagos, we are tracing the fault lines of African brotherhood and the violence that so often break the dream of that brotherhood. Welcome to my word. Welcome to the side of time. As we speak, South Africa is on edge. The June 30 deadline issued by vigilante groups for undocumented African migrants to leave South Africa has expired. Thousands have already fled. Shops are closed. Families are sleeping at police stations. They are too scared to go home. In the past few weeks, persons have been killed, and countless others have been chased from their homes. Their stores have been looted, their belongings burned. It is organized. There are groups on the road. They are going from door to door, demanding papers, ordering businesses to close. But they've been stopped in court. A judge declared their conduct unlawful and xenophobic, affirming that human dignity has no nationality. That's the point the court made. That human dignity has no nationality. But the violence continues. And the targets are almost always black migrants from Zimbabwe, Ghana, Malawi, Mozambique, Somalia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Kenya, the Democratic Republic of Congo. So in this case, it is not xenophobia in the generic sense. It is not xenophobia in the generic sense. It is Afrophobia, a specific. We are talking about vicious hostility aimed at fellow Africans by black South Africans. This is painful. It is, because it is happening in a country whose constitution is celebrated as one of the most progressive in the world. We are talking about a country that fought and won a liberation struggle, the one against the system of racial exclusion. That is the country we are talking about. How did a nation that once stood as a beacon of hope for the continent turn so violently against its own kind? South Africa was not built like other African countries. It was a settler colony, first Dutch, then British. Land was taken by force. Its original people were pushed off their farms. Their grazing fields were taken from them. Their ancestral home was occupied. That is the history of South Africa. In 1913, South Africa made it law. Over 90% of the land was reserved for the white minority. The black majority became foreigners in their own birthplace. That dispossession cut deep. It also sparked a resistance movement that looked to the rest of Africa for strength and solidarity. Early black leaders saw their own fight against white rule as part of a larger continental struggle. They called themselves Pan-Africanists. They believed no African was free until all were free. Yet, at the very same time, the apartheid government was building walls, strict pass laws, tight borders, temporary work permit for migrant miners. They treated black workers from neighboring countries as cheap hands. They made sure black South Africans and black foreigners were kept separate, suspicious, unequal. This was by design. And it planted a seed. And us versus them. That was the mindset that was planted. And that mindset has outlived apartheid itself. Then came 1994. Mandela walked free. The flag changed. South Africa rejoined the continent with open arms, at least in principle. But a new democracy inherited old memories. The economy stayed lopsided. Jobs stayed scarce. Townships stayed poor. Hope ran high, but paychecks ran low. In that gap between expectation and reality, frustration found a target. Yes. The African from across the border became the target. Today, that frustration has been weaponized by politicians, weaponized by vigilantes. They blame migrants for unemployment, crime, and collapsing services. It is about a nation forged in a struggle against racial tyranny. That country is now terrorizing its own continental kin. South Africa is now terrorizing its own continental kin. Let's trace the timeline. It started almost immediately after democracy. Between 1984 and the end of hostilities in Mozambique, an estimated 250,000 to 350,000 Mozambicans had fled to South Africa. They were fleeing civil war. They were seeking safety. They were never granted refugee status, but they were technically allowed to settle in the Bantustans, the black homelands created by the apartheid regime. The apartheid government that had created those homelands to dispossess black South Africans also used them to house refugees. And when democracy came in 1994, that is when the violence escalated. In December 1994 and January 1995, less than a year into Nelson Mandela's presidency, armed youth gangs in Alexandra, outside Johannesburg, destroyed the homes and property of suspected undocumented migrants. They marched the individuals down to the local police station and demanded that the foreigners be forcibly and immediately removed from South Africa. I thought we are South Africans. When did we stop becoming South Africans? That some persons now say they are the only South Africans. I thought we were South Africans. I am a South African. I am. I fought for the liberation of South Africa. We'll come to that. The campaign during Mandela's time blamed foreigners for crime, unemployment, and sexual attacks. The same refrain we heard in the aftermath of the minority government. But now, it was black South Africans perpetrating it against black African migrants. They did it in Mandela's time. They did it in Mbeki's time. It has become a reoccurring event in South Africa. In September 1998, two Senegalese and a Mozambican were thrown from a moving train in Johannesburg. The assault was carried out by a group returning from a rally that blamed foreigners for unemployment, crime, and even the spread of AIDS. In August 2000, 7 foreigners from different African countries were killed in South Africa. Among those attacked were 2 Nigerians, 1 Kenyan, and 2 Angolans. In October 2001, residents of the Zandspruit informal settlement gave Zimbabweans 10 days to leave the area. When the foreigners failed to leave voluntarily, they were forcibly evicted. How do you forcefully evict a man who calls a place home? How do you tell somebody who has lived in South Africa for 20 years to go home? Where can be home if not the place the person has lived in for 20 years? If I've lived in a place for 20 years, is that not home? Is that not home? What is home? I've lived in a place for 20 years. I've had children. I have married. All of a sudden somebody comes and say, I must leave now. That's not home. We need to reflect on this. Not just South Africa. It's a message for all African countries. African countries cannot even grant Africans citizenship. We're so rigid. Can't we break the borders? Let's look at it. In August 2006, more than 15 Somali traders were brought down in July of that year. More were taken out in August. Somali shops were burned. Somalis were hunted. Then came 2008. On May 11th of that year, an outburst of xenophobic violence in the Johannesburg township of Alexandra triggered attacks from all corners. It spread to different parts of South Africa. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, at least 62 people were killed. More than 670 were injured. Over 100,000 were displaced. The victims were mostly migrants from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, Somalia, Nigeria. You remember that image? That infamous image. The image that still haunts the continent. Remember that picture showing the Mozambican migrant, Ernesto being burned alive by a mob in the Ramaphosa informal settlement near Boksburg. You remember that picture of Ernesto? They set him alight. It happened under President Thabo Mbeki. He condemned the attacks. He said at the time that no one in our society has any right to explain naked criminal activity by cloaking it in the garb of xenophobia. But his administration was heavily criticized for that framing. And that pattern has been repeated again, and again. The program is State Affairs. The program is State Affairs. We are looking at South Africa. We are looking at Afrophobia. Afrophobia. We are gisting. You can also gist with me. I'll show you a number now. You can call that number so that we can gist. I am gisting. So the number is on the screen. You can gist with me by calling that number, that WhatsApp number. I don't know how you feel. I'm just a storyteller, but I also feel the pain. So to contribute, you can call that WhatsApp number. What is your experience? Are you a South African? You can call to tell me about what is going on. So we are talking about a pattern that continues to repeat itself. A pattern we've all accepted because we seem powerless to act. Afrophobia. In 2009, more than 3,000 Zimbabwean citizens were displaced in their settlement in the Western Cape. In 2013, on February 27th of that year, 8 South African police officers tied a 27-year-old Mozambican man. He was tied to the back of a police van and he was dragged down the road. He died. Yes. He died. He died because they said he's Mozambican. He has no right to live by being a Mozambican. The police is complicit. In 2015, spate of violence erupted after Zulu King Godwin made comment that foreigners should go back to their home countries because they were changing the nature of South African society. What does that mean? By April 2015, at least 7 persons were killed in South Africa. Thousands were displaced that year. And the violence spread from Durban to Johannesburg. In 2019, September to be precise, violence swept through parts of Johannesburg and Pretoria again against African migrants. Persons were killed, hundreds of businesses were looted and destroyed. At that time, Nigeria evacuated more than 500 of Nigerians out of South Africa. Why do we do that? This is not xenophobia, because xenophobia is a fear or hatred of foreigners in general. In the generic term, it is xenophobia, but we are discussing in the specific terms. Violence meted out to Africans by Africans, AFROPHOBIA. You know, white and Asian foreigners are not being attacked in the same way African migrants are attacked in South Africa. It is African bodies being burned, African shops being looted, African families being displaced. So how do South Africa justify this? Is it economic competition? The claim that foreign nationals are stealing jobs? The argument that they are overburdening public services? But the data tells a different story. A survey shows that in 2022, the unemployment rate among immigrants were 18.2%. They are also unemployed. But the real culprits are not migrants. The issues are structural. Some have talked about deindustrialization. Some have talked about trade liberalization. Some have talked about the decline of high labor absorbing sectors like manufacturing and textiles. Some have blamed the economic policies of the post-apartheid government. Some have talked about the wealth that remains concentrated in white hands. 10% of the population still owns more than 85% of the country's wealth. So who will explain it to South Africans? As we present this show, over 25,000 people, mostly Zimbabweans, Malawians, and Nigerians, have been repatriated in recent time. And over 50,000 undocumented immigrants had been arrested since the beginning of the year. The scale is staggering. The pattern is undeniable. In May this year, former South African President Thabo Mbeki, standing before a high-level gathering in Cape Town, denounced the Afrophobic disposition of some South Africans. It was an event hosted by the Thabo Mbeki Foundation in collaboration with AUDA and NEPAD. It was meant to celebrate 25 years of the new Partnership for Africa's Development. Mbeki began by acknowledging the pain. He knew that South Africans are suffering. He talked about high unemployment, talked about crime and inequality. He looked at the daily grind of survival in a country where the promise of 1994 has not reached everyone. So he made the point. But the finger, he declared, is being pointed at the wrong people. Yes, he made that point. Let's listen to Thabo Mbeki as he defines the ongoing events in South Africa.
Now, we've got many problems here. Problem legitimately raised. Huge levels of unemployment. That's correct. High levels of crime. That's correct. But the finger is being pointed at wrong people. The levels of high unemployment in this country are not due. They are not due to undocumented Africans. They are not. We know the history in detail of how South Africa, 1994 to 2000, 2008, 2009, the country goes up like this. Growth rates reach 6%. From 2009 goes the opposite direction. Doesn't caused by undocumented immigrants. The people who caused that, you look at it, that decline, they are laughing in a corner there. Because we're pointing not at them, but we're pointing somewhere else. It's wrong. It's a problem the South Africans must deal with. You can imagine what the person in Guinea-Conakry says, that I now say to this Guinea-Conakry who was walking the streets of Johannesburg, go home. They don't understand it. And the reason they don't understand it is because during the course of the struggle, the continent came to own South Africa. If very, very much South African. This South African struggle was not just a South African struggle, it was their struggle. So, one prediction I will make, the Africans will continue to come to South Africa. Doesn't matter what you do. You can't change the hearts and the minds of this African. It's a particular frame of mind with regard to South Africa which they help to liberate. What we as South Africans have got to do is to say, how do we deal with this? You are not going to solve the problem of unemployment here by shouting against undocumented Africans and leave the culprit. The culprits are sitting here. I can even tell you their names. But we're pointing fingers at the wrong people and people are shouting. I'm saying that there's a regression that's taken place. That sense of African integration that we had 25 years ago, I think has receded. Why? I don't know. But that's a question that we must ask and answer. I'm saying the internalization of this integration of the African continent among us South Africans is not there. Well, maybe I'm not exact. No, it's declined. You have a similar phenomenon on the continent.
State Affairs with Edmondo Bilo is live.
Former South African President Thabo Mbeki speaking there, he made a prediction that Africans will keep coming. That Africans will keep coming to South Africa. That's profound. Mbeki did not mince words. Mbeki rejected the narrative that undocumented African migrants are responsible for South Africa's economic collapse. He pointed to the data. He reminded his audience that South Africa grew at rates reaching 6% between 1994 and 2008. That was the era of post-apartheid hope. That was the era when the country was integrating into the global economy, when infrastructure was being built, when the African Renaissance was more than a slogan. But from 2009 onward, Mbeki noted that it goes the opposite direction: economic decline, stagnation, and rising joblessness. It is the story of South Africa. It is the story of Africa. That's the story we are telling. Mbeki pointed to the data. He said it isn't caused by undocumented immigrants. So what caused it? Mbeki accused South Africans of letting the real culprits escape. Who are the real culprits? He says the people who caused that decline, they are laughing in a corner there because we are not pointing. Because we are pointing not at them, but we are pointing somewhere else. It is wrong. Mbeki accused South Africans of letting the real culprit escape while chasing shadows. Let's look at this crucial matter. For decades, the African states that are now evacuating their citizens from South Africa, countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, they stood with South Africans. These countries sacrificed blood, treasure, and political capital to help dismantle the very apartheid system that now produces the violence driving their citizens home. By 1960, the African National Congress, ANC, was banned, its leaders driven underground or into exile. We are tracing it. By 1960, the African National Congress, ANC, was banned. Its leaders were driven underground, some were driven into exile. The liberation movement had no choice but to extend the struggle into the international arena, and the first place they turned was the African continent.
Zambia very quickly, so that by the time we come to arrest him, he's not here. Because we don't want to embarrass the ANC. And indeed, that's what happened. Another story, a sad story. There was the Prime Minister of Tanzania. His name was Sokoine. In a convoy in an area of Tanzania where there were a lot of our people. And one of our drivers knocked Premier Sokoine's car and killed him. He died. So you can imagine we're sitting in Lusaka and the news comes, and I don't know what the Tanzanians did, but we were all of us so scared that Sokoine is very popular. Is to turn the whole country against the ANC. Didn't. It didn't. They handled it in such a way that you couldn't sense that there was any sense of hate from the Tanzanians towards ourselves. I'm talking about a particular kind of relationship that we had with the rest of the continent.
Let's talk about Nigeria's contribution to the liberation struggle in South Africa. Today, South Africans point fingers at Nigerians. The record tells a different story. The record tells us that without Nigeria, there might have been no democratic South Africa. In March 1960, the Sharpeville massacre took the world by surprise. South African police opened fire on peaceful protesters, killing 72 black South Africans and wounding many. The images galvanized the African continent. And Nigeria, which had achieved her independence just 6 months earlier, responded with speed. Nigeria banned the importation of South African goods. It led the charge to expel South Africa from the Commonwealth at the Commonwealth Prime Ministers' Conference in London in March 1961. A statement from Nigeria's Prime Minister at the time, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, expressed solidarity with the African National Congress, ANC. Nigeria terminated all Commonwealth privileges that South Africa had enjoyed on Nigerian soil. From that moment, South African whites were treated as foreigners. But Nigeria didn't stop at that. Nigeria put its money where its mouth was. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Nigeria was the first African country to provide direct financial aid to the ANC. By the 1970s, Nigeria was supporting the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress with an annual subvention of more than $5 million. $5 million at that time. Then came 1976, the Soweto uprising. School children protesting the imposition of Afrikaans in their classrooms. What did the government do? The South African government responded with bullets. Have you seen the picture? These children were cut down. Thousands were imprisoned, and many fled into exile. Nigeria's response was immediate. General Olusegun Obasanjo, then head of state, established the Southern Africa Relief Fund. The government contributed $3.7 million. Obasanjo personally donated $3,000. Every member of his cabinet gave $1,500. Ordinary Nigerians contributed. Civil servants contributed 2% of their salaries to the cause. It became known as the Mandela tax. Students skipped their lunch at school just to be able to contribute to the struggle to liberate South Africa. In 6 months, the fund had amassed more than $10 million, all sent directly to the South African freedom fighters from Nigeria. It has been estimated that Nigeria spent over $61 billion from 1960 to 1995 to help fight apartheid and bring democracy to South Africa. That is huge investment. I am a South African. South Africa is my home. It's our land. I don't know about you. It's our land. See, Nigeria refused to sell oil to apartheid South Africa. In 1979, Nigeria went a step further and nationalized British petroleum assets in the country. And Nigeria did that in direct protest against international complicity with apartheid. And Nigeria accused Britain of siding with the minority government in South Africa. Nigeria's educational contribution was equally huge. Through the Southern Africa Relief Fund, hundreds of South African exiles received scholarships to study in Nigeria. And they studied free of charge. Nigeria took care of them. Let me bring you this interview with Shola Olorunyomi, a professor at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ibadan. Olorunyomi will take you into the past in this story. There are lessons to take away from Professor Shola Olorunyomi's story. It's a liberation story.
My own experience, I had the benefit of, at this point also, living with people who had been in bigger struggles. You remember, Nigeria used to welcome people from the southern African states.
Yes.
Yeah. I remember that even in high school, I was coordinator for my school of the SARF, South Africa Relief Fund. And I think the Senate leader, Senator Saraki, the father of Bukola's Abubakar Saraki, was the national. But in schools, we had this literally two student formations, mobilizing and doing exciting things. So at that point, I got acquainted with, much later in life, with the excitement of what I'd known a bit about the South African frontline states, Southern African region. I met Pa Chope, the representative who will be today. There was no independence then, so there couldn't be an ambassador. but he was the country rep on behalf of the African National Congress. So I started living with him after I left straight from the Defense Academy. So, and then I stayed with him, and then he, I won't ever forget this day. We were watching TV, and the Nigerian government had done something really, in my opinion, really sad. They needed to form a quorum at the OAU, and they needed maybe just one vote. And Nigeria said, when there's a quorum, then they will join. And that there was no quorum. But they were saying there was no quorum by abstaining, but for some reasons they didn't want to encourage Gaddafi. Was he trying to be chairman then or not? I don't remember. But he became chairman later. I remember that. Anyway, so Nigeria couldn't. So Gaddafi came on air and blasted Nigeria, the Gaddafi. And I was excited that, yes, this was a radical move. And I noticed that I was the only one doing that in the room. I was kind of disappointed. What kind of South Africans were these? I mean, Nigeria wouldn't go. Is it that you want OAU to fail? Because this was the same OAU from high school that took such stance against apartheid, and the great, speeches of Murtala Muhammad, Obasanjo and co, and, all of the Joe Gaba, and so they said, no, a statesman shouldn't speak that way.
A statesman shouldn't speak.
Yeah, the way Gaddafi had spoken. I was like, why wouldn't that be? And they said, the way he had spoken, he didn't disaggregate Nigerians from their leader or their leaders. They lumped everything, so it could also evoke anger from the average Nigerian. And even for their leaders, since it's a long-drawn struggle, they could be under other influences. I think from the West, as we later got to know, that it could be a lot softer. It could be more diplomatic. It could be. So I knew that all of the radical texts I had read from high school, George Jackson, Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, Malcolm X, I had to take it easy. Yeah, so I started knowing what realpolitik was, these old Asian people. I mean, sometimes the likes of Oliver Tambo will come in. The father of Mbeki.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of them came in and out of that same house,
You met them?
Oh, of course, yes. That was secretariat, don't forget. I met all of these people then and all that. They'll come. Of course, I wouldn't be part of their meetings, but I'll always be around doing one thing or the other. Papa took me under his wing, the late Papa Chopin,
So what was happening to your mind while you were encountering these figures?
As a young person, you're excited on the prospects that they had not given up. It's such, can you imagine what it was? You had learned this thing from history. You had read some, elsewhere about, the Declaration of the Rights of Man from the 19th century. You read about Garibaldi. You read about Bismarck. These are high school and HSC stuff. And then the independence of the United States, the 1917 revolution in Russia, all pointing, and the attack of the Bastille, 1789 in France, declaring the Republic. And then suddenly, they say because of your skin. And the trauma that a black boy goes through, with that kind of conscience is terrible. Because it was after high school, I had to start going from one West African country to the other, just in order to be sure that the black man did anything of value.
But was that a trend at that time? Or it was just Oloruyomi
and
his mind?
No, people paid attention to different things, but I had a supporting family in that direction. Family, friends, etc., etc. No, it wasn't just mine.
So at that point, would you describe yourself as a radical?
I think I was just I just was not happy. I just wasn't too happy because the idea that black people were inferior, I was just happy with that.
Yes, you just heard the voice of Professor Shola Olorunyomi of the Institute of African Studies, University of Ibadan. Taking us into the past, the liberation struggle, how he was inspired by South Africans who were in Nigeria, the lessons he learned relating with them. They were here. We loved them. We loved them. We will always love them. Despite the pains, the stories coming out from South Africa, I also feel their pain. That is why we are getting to the point where we need to redeem the African continent. It is due, and it's a task that must be done. Nigeria stood with South Africa. The solidarity wasn't just institutional. Through the Southern Africa Relief Fund, hundreds of South Africans received scholarships to study in Nigerian universities. Olorunyomi mentioned the fund in that interview. Remember the National Committee Against Apartheid? Founded by the Nigerian government in the 1960s? That committee ensured that South Africans resident in Nigeria could attend school, with workers contributing financially to their support. Nigeria also issued hundreds of Nigerian passports to South Africans who had fled the country, giving them the ability to travel internationally when their own passports were worthless. Many ANC leaders were issued Nigerian passports to move around the world. It wasn't just institutional solidarity. Nigerian students and academics were at the forefront of the anti-apartheid campaign on university campuses across the country. Nigerian musicians also joined the fight. Sonny Okosu, remember that song? Fire in Soweto. I wish I could play you that song now, but we don't have the right to play it. The song was released in 1978. Search for the song, Fire in Soweto. You'll find it on YouTube. It was part of the struggle against apartheid. There was also the diplomatic front. In 1977, Nigeria hosted the World Conference for Action Against Apartheid in Lagos. The international gathering brought together representatives from the United Nations, Asian nations, and non-governmental organizations, all united in the commitment to dismantle white minority rule. At the United Nations, Nigeria chaired the Special Committee Against Apartheid for 3 decades. Nigeria co-sponsored numerous resolutions calling for comprehensive sanctions against the apartheid regime. Nigeria used its influence to isolate South Africa diplomatically, ensuring that the apartheid regime was treated as a pariah state on the global stage. Nigeria fought for South Africa. And then came 1990. Nelson Mandela walked free. And the first country Mandela visited, yes, Algeria. But not long after, Mandela came to Nigeria. He came to say thank you. Nigeria, during that visit, contributed millions of dollars to Mandela and the ANC. In 1994, Nigeria and South Africa established full diplomatic relations. So, where is this xenophobic attack coming from? Why is it directed towards Africans? Afrophobia. That is the betrayal of history. On 23rd of May this year, just days after Mbeki gave his address, Kayode Fayemi, a former governor of Ekiti State, a professor of international affairs, he stepped to the podium at the 16th Africa Day lecture. The event was hosted by the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the University of South Africa in Cape Town. Fayemi spoke. He delivered a diagnosis. Instead of diplomatic pleasantries, he spoke of a wound that refuses to heal. Fayemi reminded us that South Africa's liberation was not won by South Africans alone. He was in Cape Town. He was talking to South Africans. Let's go back to that speech in May 2026.
But no conversation about African unity can avoid the question of solidarity. Because solidarity is ultimately the more. But no conversation about African unity can avoid the question of solidarity. Because solidarity is ultimately the moral foundation upon which Pan-Africanism rests. African unity cannot be sustained merely through treaties, summits, or diplomatic declarations. It must be rooted in a shared emotional and historical consciousness, a recognition that the destiny of African peoples remains interconnected. The great contemporary architects of Pan-Africanism understood this very clearly. Great leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Patrice Lumumba, Nelson Mandela, and if I dare say so, Thabo Mbeki, to cite a few of them, understood it, and their legacy has consistently reminded us that Africa's future depends not only on economic cooperation, but also, quite importantly, on the cultivation of a deeper continental consciousness. Pan-Africanism was never simply about political coordination among states. It was fundamentally a moral project. A project grounded in the belief that the dignity of one African is tied to the dignity of all Africans. And that is why we must confront honestly and courageously the troubling rise of Afrophobia and xenophobia. Within parts of our continent, including here in South Africa. Let me speak carefully but candidly, because I'm a Nigerian. South Africa's liberation was not won by South Africans alone. Thankfully, President Mbeki recently reminded us of that solemn truth. The anti-apartheid struggle became a continental responsibility. Across Africa, nations and citizens made sacrifices in support of South Africa's freedom. African countries offered sanctuary to exiles and liberation movements. As a young university student in Nigeria in the early 1980s, I and several of my colleagues gained our Pan-African consciousness working at the ANC and SWAPO offices in Kefi, Lagos. Under the tutelage of President Mbeki, then our chief representative of the ANC, and later Comrades Mark Shope and Comrade Victor Matlow, successive chief representatives, and also Comrade Kampala and Herman Ichete, chief representatives of SWAPO in Nigeria at the time. African workers and taxpayers contributed resources to support the liberation effort. African intellectuals mobilized international solidarity. African leaders paid diplomatic and economic cost in confronting apartheid. Nigeria, among many others, stood firmly in support of South Africa's liberation. But this was not charity. It was solidarity. It was an understanding that oppression anywhere in Africa threatened dignity everywhere in Africa. This shared history matters profoundly. And that is why violence or hostility directed at fellow Africans anywhere on the continent must concern us deeply. Afrophobia is not merely a law enforcement issue or a question of migration policy. It represents a crisis of continental consciousness that negates the continental renaissance that we all seek. But at the same time, we must approach this issue with maturity and honesty. Xenophobia does not emerge in a social vacuum. It is often fueled by economic inequality, unemployment, weak governance, poor service delivery, political manipulation, and institutional distrust. I do not minimize the genuine hardship that produce such desperate reasonings. Youth unemployment is not a statistic. It is a daily humiliation. And when institutions fail to provide relief, communities will sometimes violently seek to define the boundary of who belongs to where. Ghanaians did it in 1969 when the Busia government sent Nigerians packing. Nigeria retaliated in 1979 and 1981 when the Shagari government sent Ghanaians back home in the Ghana Must Go episode. In societies where citizens feel economically insecure, frustration can easily be redirected towards the most vulnerable groups. But that understanding is not exoneration. Whilst we must acknowledge these pressures, which are largely the inheritance of apartheid structural deformations, we must never legitimize violence or exclusion against fellow Africans. If Africans cannot coexist peacefully with one another, then the dream of continental integration will remain fundamentally weakened. The African continental free trade area cannot flourish in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion. Regional integration cannot deepen where fear and hostility dominate public life. Africa, therefore, requires a renewed ethos of continental citizenship that emphasizes that sovereignty is not in conflict with solidarity. We must teach younger generations that being proudly Nigerian, South African, Kenyan, Ghanaian, or Senegalese is entirely compatible with being proudly African.
You just listened to a lecture delivered by Dr. Kayode Fayemi, a former governor of Ekiti State. He delivered that lecture in South Africa in May 2026. He spoke his mind, and his lecture was well received. So we've talked about the contribution of Nigeria to the struggle for the liberation of South Africa. Another country that contributed well is Algeria. Algeria was among the first to answer the call. President Ahmed Ben Bella, speaking just after Algeria's own bloody war for independence, made a declaration that would define an era. He said, and I quote, "We have no right to think of eating better when people fall in Angola, Mozambique, and South Africa. But we have a ransom to pay," he continues. "We must accept to die together so that African unity does not become a vain word." That is Ben Bella, former president of Algeria, making the point. Look at what he said in support of the struggle against apartheid. He said, "We have no right to think of eating better when people fall in Angola, Mozambique, and South Africa. But we have a ransom to pay. We must accept to die together so that African unity does not become a vain word." In 1961, 3 years before the ANC was banned, 5 years before Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment, you know what Algeria did? They helped Mandela to travel to Algeria using a fake passport. Mandela traveled using a fake passport to Algeria. He traveled on a fake Ethiopian passport. His destination, the training camps of the Algerian National Liberation Front. He went to train on guerrilla tactics, how to shoot. You know, the ANC was described as a terrorist organization in South Africa. The way IPOB have been described as a terrorist organization, ANC was also described as a terrorist organization, but it ended up liberating South Africa. And Mandela traveled in a fake Ethiopian passport to Algeria. His destination was the training camps of the Algerian National Liberation Front, the FLN. Algeria had just won its own brutal war of independence against French colonialism. And Mandela, who had been studying guerrilla warfare, wanted to learn from those who had actually fought and won. In his memoir, Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela revealed just how profound that encounter was. He writes that his struggle against apartheid was greatly inspired by the struggle of the Algerian soldiers. The FLN provided the African National Congress with weapons. They shared military tactics. They trained his comrades. And decades later, when Mandela finally walked from prison, in February 1990, he made a choice, and that choice spoke volumes. The very first country that Mandela visited after he became a free man was Algeria. That is to tell you about the huge contribution of Algeria to the liberation struggle. Standing in Algiers, Mandela declared, and these are the words he used. He says, "The Algerian army made me a man." The Algerian army made me a man. But Algeria's solidarity also continued. In November 1964, while Mandela was on trial for his life at the Rivonia trial, the University of Algiers conferred an honorary doctorate of literature on South African giant Albert Luthuli, the ANC President General. Remember that name? Albert Luthuli. The doctorate degree was a symbolic act, and it was in the context of the time. It was a rebuke to apartheid's claim that black South Africans were intellectually inferior. Then came 1974, and that was an important moment in the international isolation of apartheid South Africa. That year, Algeria's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, was presiding over the United Nations General Assembly. He successfully lobbied for the expulsion of South Africa's representation from the General Assembly. He argued that South Africa's delegates were invalid because they represented only a white minority. They did not speak for the majority of South Africans. And on that basis, the Assembly voted to unseat South Africa. It was a diplomatic earthquake. Bouteflika, then Minister of External Affairs Algeria, would later become the President of Algeria. Now let's talk about the role of the frontline states. The frontline states, their role towards the liberation of South Africa. The essence is to explain that the South Africa of today belongs to all of us. The way I feel Nigeria belongs to a Kenyan. Come and explore. Why are we creating these borders when we can explore together? Let's look at the role of the frontline states in the fight against white minority rule in South Africa. From Algeria's revolutionary solidarity, let's look at countries that bore the heaviest burden. The ones that didn't just send weapons or cast diplomatic votes. The ones that opened their borders. The ones that sheltered the hunted. And they paid in blood. They were called the frontline states, a loose coalition of African nations. They are Angola, Botswana, Lesotho, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, and later Zimbabwe. These were the countries that surrounded apartheid South Africa. They were on the front lines geographically, economically, and militarily. And they made a choice. Their choice was to end white minority rule, even if it cost them everything. So let's go back to 1975. That's when the frontline states, then consisting of Botswana, Lesotho, Tanzania, and Zambia, were formally recognized as an entity by the Organization of African Unity. They became a committee of the Assembly of Heads of State, and they were joined by Angola and Mozambique later. The leadership of the frontline states was formidable. Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere, the architect of African socialism, the moral conscience of the continent, served as chairman until he retired in 1985. He was succeeded by Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda, another giant of the liberation struggle, a man who turned Lusaka into the diplomatic capital of anti-apartheid resistance. Did you get that? Kaunda once said, and I quote, "Our own freedom is incomplete without the freedom of our brothers and sisters in South Africa." Nkrumah also made a similar statement. What Kaunda did was to remind us of the existential commitment needed to live together. Now, here's what makes this story a story that we must teach our children. The economies of nearly all the frontline states were dependent on South Africa. They relied on South African railways, South African ports, South African electricity. Millions of their citizens worked in South African mines, and they worked in their farms. They were, in many ways, economically captive to the very regime that they opposed, yet they did not waver. The frontline states supported and sheltered exiled political movement leaders, men who were opposed to apartheid, not just from South Africa, but from Namibia and from Rhodesia, that later became Zimbabwe. The frontline states provided asylum for South African political activists. They allowed the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress to set up headquarters within their borders. The ANC was declared the official representative of South African people by both the United Nations and the African Union, then OAU, Organization of African Unity. Think about that. The official headquarters of the ANC outside South Africa was in Lusaka, Zambia. This story by Thabo Mbeki will give us a new understanding. Thabo Mbeki is a former president of South Africa. He takes us into the past.
I keep telling stories about what happened in the past. In terms of our relationship as a liberation movement with the rest of the continent. I tell a story, for instance, of one of the cadres of the ANC in Zambia who became our person at the airport. So he received us coming in, going out. It was very familiar furniture at Lusaka International Airport, such that they would allow him free run of the airport. He would run, get into the planes on the tarmac and all that. And one day, the Zambia police come to the ANC office and they say, we'd like, his name was Oshkosh. That was his pseudonym. They said, can we please see Oshkosh? But let him come with one of your senior people. So I was asked to accompany Oshkosh to the Zambia police. And the police officer says, Oshkosh, you have free run of the airport because you work for the ANC. And what you've been doing, some planes land in Lusaka. You walk into the plane to collect drugs from drug dealers. You walk through the airport with the drugs. The drug dealer is Zambian, comes through the airport as it's clean, and you hand over the drugs to them outside. So my mouth is dropping. So the police officer said, now, but Oshkosh denied what I'm saying. He couldn't. And so we wanted to tell you, Oshkosh, this thing. So that's the end of the business. So we stand up to look out. The police officer says to me, no, Mr. Mbeki, please, I want to talk to you. So Oshkosh leaves. And so he says, we are going to arrest the Zambians who are drug dealers. Now, we want you to get Oshkosh out of Zambia very quickly, so that by the time we come to arrest him, he's not here. Because we don't want to embarrass the ANC. And indeed, that's what happened. Another story, a sad story. There was the Prime Minister of Tanzania. His name was Sokoine. Prime Minister Sokoine was driving in a convoy in an area of Tanzania where there were a lot of our people. And one of our drivers knocked Premier Sokoine's car and killed him. He died. So you can imagine we're sitting in Lusaka and the news comes, and I don't know what the Tanzanians did. But we were all of us so scared that Sokoine is very popular. Is to turn the whole country against the ANC, didn't. It didn't. They handled it in such a way that you couldn't sense that there was any a sense of hate from the Tanzanians towards ourselves. I'm talking about a particular kind of relationship that we had with the rest of the continent. Guinea Conakry, during the time of Sékou Touré, they taught South African liberation struggle from school to university. If anybody wanted to know anybody on the continent who knew anything about the struggle in South Africa, the ANC, this and that and the other, what battles and so on, the Guineans. Not so much that they should have the knowledge, but they should support the struggle that was taking place here. So when I first went to Guinea, long after Sékou Touré died, the president complained to me. He said, you know, you people got your liberation in 94, and President Mandela has been visiting many African countries. And I keep telling stories about what happened in the past. In terms of our relationship, I don't know what the Tanzanians did, but we were all of us so scared that Sokoine is very popular. Is to turn the whole country against the ANC. It didn't. They handled it in such a way that you couldn't sense that there was any a sense of hate from the Tanzanians towards ourselves. I'm talking about a particular kind of relationship that we had with the rest of the continent. Guinea Conakry, during the time of Sékou Touré, they taught South African liberation struggle from school to university. If anybody wanted to know anybody on the continent who knew anything about the struggle in South Africa, the ANC, this and that and the other, what battles and so on, the Guineans. Not so much that they should have the knowledge, but they should support the struggle that was taking place here. So when I first went to Guinea, long after Sékou Touré died, the president complained to me. He said, you know, you people got your liberation in 94, and President Mandela has been visiting many African countries and overflies Conakry. You've done the same thing. You overfly Conakry. And yet, these are these people. We were, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was foreign minister. So she decides to go window shopping in Conakry, and she goes into a jewelry shop. And she's looking, she was just window shopping. And the shopkeeper says, Madam, just choose, which one do you prefer there? Which one do you think is the best for you? No, I'm window, no, I know you're window shopping, just have a look. So she does. She says this one. The shopkeeper takes it out, wraps it up and gives it to her. So she says, no, but I'm not buying anything. She says, I'm not selling it to you. I'm giving it to you. Are you not the foreign minister of South Africa? Yes, I am. This is for us from the people of Guinea. You see, what I'm trying to tell is a particular story of a relationship that we had with the African continent.
That is Thabo Mbeki, former president of South Africa, speaking about the liberation struggle. And there are lessons to always learn when we listen to experienced men like Thabo Mbeki. I want to bring you an interview I had with Winnie Odinga, the daughter of the popular Kenyan politician Raila Odinga that died last year. In this interview, Winnie Odinga examines Afrophobia in South Africa. Winnie Odinga is the daughter of Kenyan opposition leader Raila Odinga. She is currently serving as a member of the East African Legislative Assembly. So here, she takes us into the past, brings us into the moment, and takes us into the future. Winnie Odinga on State Affairs. You have a name, Winnie, and there's a Winnie Mandela from South Africa. In recent time, you can see the stories coming out from South Africa. Afrophobia,
yes,
xenophobia. How does that make you feel?
It's terrible. I mean, the first thing is we have to outrightly condemn xenophobia. But the second thing is to think about why this is happening. You see, the South African was sold a dream. And they were sold that after apartheid, everything would be wonderful and they would achieve certain freedoms. So they managed to achieve political freedom. They managed to get to majority rule. However, what they never managed to actually achieve was economic freedom. And that is a whole structure that was set up from even during apartheid. So right now, the modern South African is asking, they're unable to get a job or whatever, their services are bad, but it's very difficult to pinpoint economic structural failure. So what happens is it's easier to pinpoint the person who is right in front of you, the person who owns a shop in the neighborhood or whatever. It's easier to blame them than it is to blame the structure of their society. So I think they need to have a much deeper conversation, a conversation on a deeper level on the structural adjustment or the political freedom vis-a-vis their economic empowerment.
Is it also a function of the politics of South Africa?
Absolutely. And South Africa is not unique. Every country, Kenya is like that, in terms of people manipulating the animus of those in the lower income, manipulating their poverty, manipulating their life situation, where it's like we discussed earlier, where somebody can sell themselves in order to eat. It happens at all stages of power throughout this, all sorts of systems of power throughout this continent. And that idea of our turn to eat, or somebody wants to get a majority or make a move business-wise and inciting here and there, it's certainly a function of the politics.
But I thought South Africans would know that the South Africa they are saying belongs to them. It belongs to all of us. We fought for it. Don't you think so?
I believe, yes, of course, we absolutely did.
Many African states were front-line states against apartheid.
The truth is on paper. You are 100% correct. But that doesn't matter to the younger South African. I told you I was born in 1990. There are people who were born in 2007. I was just reading the other day, this Barcelona player, Lamine Yamal, was born in 2007. To that person, the history of Africa is not applicable in their everyday life. They don't understand the connection of that. And it's very much that we're placing on them an emotional responsibility, and they're shunning that emotional part of that.
They should have been taught that in schools.
They should have, yes. Absolutely.
That is the essence of education.
Absolutely.
So that you are not cut off from history.
I don't think it's being cut off from history. I think they're feeling, how long do they owe? How long will they have to owe that debt for?
Perhaps they are also saying we should collapse the borders.
I mean,
let's roam free as Africans.
I 100% agree with you.
Because there are times, sometimes when I want to travel to South Africa and I'm going to apply for visa, I don't feel okay about it. I don't like it.
I 100% agree with you.
There was one time I didn't go to the embassy. I said, I'm not going.
It's quite a hassle. It has
because
been.
I'm a student of history. Yeah. I knew how much Nigeria contributed to the fight against apartheid.
I certainly agree with your sentiment. What I try and do is understand what is fundamentally causing this. What creates the attitude that will cause somebody come out and destroy their business of their neighbor, or kill their neighbor, or do violence against other Africans. And there's similarity in cultures, especially cultures that have been oppressed for a very long time. When I was in school in America, I found it very difficult to get along with African Americans. The African American and the South African are very similar in attitude to me, if I can be general. There's a feeling of they may be the only ones who have the right to feel oppressed. Whereas you'll have other societies where you'll get along better with those from the Caribbean countries because they went through colonialism like you went through colonialism. And so when you're trying to figure out, or when I'm trying to figure out the fundamental thing, I can't force my feelings that they should be grateful. I have to understand their feeling that young South African basically just doesn't care.
And to think that at some point in the 1960s, Ghana did the same thing. Ghana expelled all Africans under the Busia regime. And my history book tells me that Nigeria did same to many Africans in the 1980s. Especially Ghanaians were sent out of Nigeria. Today we have bags called Ghana Must Go bags.
I know the color.
Ghanaians used that bag to run out of Nigeria. So we don't learn from history in Africa.
I don't think it's purely an African issue. I think right now nationalism is reigning supreme all over the world. If you see what's happening with Trump in America and and the Latinos. If you go to Europe and how they're expelling, foreigners, the extreme right has taken root in the world, and nationalism is center stage. It's the hot button issue.
But we are Africans.
Yes, we are.
Is Africa not a country?
It's not a country. It's it should be a community. It should be a family. It should be.
It should be. Speaking there with Winnie Odinga, the daughter of Kenyan political leader Raila Odinga, former Prime Minister of Kenya. Raila Odinga died last year. His daughter Winnie Odinga is currently serving as a member of the East African Legislative Assembly. Watch out for the video of my interview with Winnie Odinga. We spoke about Africa, and we'll be releasing the interview soon. We spoke about Raila Odinga because she was with her daddy when the father died in India. She was the private secretary to her father. She told interesting stories about time. That interview will be shared on all my social media platforms. As we round off this edition of State Affairs, we will also come up with part 2 because we have asked a question: how did we get here? We've talked about Nigeria also behaving like South Africa of the moment. How Ghana expelled African migrants in the 1960s. How Nigeria did same in the 1980s. But in the case of South Africa, it has become a constant. Every year there's a story about South Africans chasing other Africans. And you begin to ask, why South Africa all the time? So what we have done with this edition is to trace the organic connection between African states and South Africa, how Africans came together to fight for the liberation of that country. And I gave example of Nigeria, Algeria, and the frontline states like Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Mozambique. These were the frontline states. They came together. Tanzania, Lesotho. So how do you tell these countries not to live in South Africa, despite their contribution to the liberation of South Africa? In 1990, when Nelson Mandela walked out of prison after 27 years, he spoke of African states as family. At a rally in Durban just weeks after his release, Mandela quoted his predecessor, ANC President General Albert Lutuli, who had himself won the Nobel Peace Prize. Lutuli once said, I quote, "I personally believe that here in South Africa, with all of our diversities of color and race, we will show the world a new pattern of democracy. I think that there is a challenge to us in South Africa to set a new example for the world. End of quote. That was the dream. That was the promise African states had fought for. So what happened? So watch out for part 2 of Afrophobia. We'll go back to Ghana and Nigeria. Perhaps South Africa learned from both countries. Thank you for being part of this edition of State Affairs. And don't forget to join me on Saturday morning. On Splash 105.5 FM, the Integrity Station, at 8 a.m. I sound tired, right? Yes, I'm tired. But we've done tonight's edition. So on Saturday morning, 8 a.m. West African time, I'll be with you on this page. So let's do it together again. Thank you for being there.